Okay, welcome everybody to the first of this year's Ibstock lecture series. Delighted to welcome Cormac, Farrelly, an associate from Allford Hall, Monaghan Morris Architects. Cormac's based in Bristol, to talk about some of the work that the Bristol office has been doing over the last few years, and in particular talk about a school project in Birmingham. For those of you who don't know the practice, Allford Hall, Monaghan Morris have an office in London, a small office in Bristol, and a small office in Oklahoma as well. They have over 250 architectural staff, roughly. Working across all sectors of the built environment. They're multi-award winning, currently the third place practice in the Architects Journal, 120 best practices in the UK, shortlisted for the RIBA Sterling Prize this year, and been shortlisted in previous years. They've also won Building Designs Architect of the Year and Practice of the Year 2013 and 2009. So it's a real honour to have Cormac come and talk to us and tell you a little bit about the work that him and the practice are doing out of the office in Bristol. So, Cormac.
Brilliant. Can everyone hear me? Or is that... Yeah, okay. Thanks, Matt. I'm not sure if you know, Matt used to work with us for quite a number of years, so he knows us very well. I'm going to talk today a little bit about what we do in Bristol, a quick overview of what we do, and then I'm going to have a little bit of a rant about the government, and then I'll talk about one of our projects which we completed. We designed and delivered out of the Bristol studio at a very particular time, in the recession. So we're actually about 330 people now, but about 250 architectural staff based between London, Bristol and Oklahoma. There's about 40 of us in Bristol, 41 if you count Bryn, here comes in one day a week. And we work across all sectors, really. We don't really have, people, we have teams working on specific sectors. So education is a big one for us, Westminster Academy and Burntwood School there, both Sterling Prize nominated. Across the arts, you can see the Saatchi Gallery and the Barbican Arts Centre. Healthcare, we don't do so much of this, but generally the smaller projects, North London Hospice to the right, really interesting typology. And we do lots of housing. I'm not going to talk about housing today very much. I believe there's lots of people coming in to talk about housing. Also schools, so sorry if I'm going to bore you about schools today. And then office buildings. We were working on Google headquarters to the left there until it got canned about 6 months ago, but maybe that one will come back again. Out of the Bristol studio, again, we're kind of a microcosm of the London office. So one big project, which is Television Centre, you can see on the left-hand side a sketch which evolved out of the Bristol office has turned into a massive master plan, 1,000 homes in West London in the old BBC centre. So there's about 30 people working on that now exclusively in the London office, but interesting to see how kind of a sketch will gestate into a much larger project. This is a scheme in Falmouth, a retirement home facing Falmouth Bay. And this is really interesting, working with a developer, looking at reinventing the retirement home sector, people who are downsizing and what kind of accommodation they might want. And it's all about flexibility, storage. And this particular scheme here, all south-facing, you've got these massive balconies, almost conceived as outdoor rooms, which offer shade and amenity facing out into the sea. And then the architectural language coming out of that is very much a kind of modern take on the Cornish vernacular or the Falmouth vernacular. And then another retirement home here in Bristol in for planning. I was going to talk about this, but I don't want to tempt fate because we're for planning committee next week. But again, some of the similar concepts, looking at reinventing the retirement home sector in a very particular context. And then this is a scheme in the very early stages in the centre of Bristol called the Pithay. It's actually a refurbishment of an old office block. What we really find interesting about this, and I believe Pocket Housing are coming in to see you next week to talk about kind of how you might design for a different sector, for a rental sector, but smaller flats as well. And it's all about kind of the social aspect of living, squeezing the bedrooms, putting lots of storage in there. You can see here 2 doors into the flat rather than 1. So kind of interesting ideas as well, just trying to think about how people who are renting might want, or what they might want out of housing, rather than the typical market housing. So this is the scheme I'm going to talk to you about. It's kind of a 5-year project for us in the Bristol studio. Started in 2009, finished 2014. Quite a stop-start program, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But this was part of the Labour government's Building Schools for the Future programme, one of the most ambitious building programmes of the last century, where they plan to rebuild every single school in the country because they're all falling apart, to be honest. And they still are, a lot of them. So, in case you didn't know where Birmingham is, it's a little bit north of Bristol. So it's a kind of perfect triangle between our London studio, Bristol, and Birmingham. So it kind of came our way. We were doing a number of schools in the London office. But just about the time we were going in for planning, this happened. There's lots of things I could say about this, but you kind of get that cuddly graphic at the top, the Department for Schools and Families, turned into the Department of Education. And Michael Gove came in and went about dismantling everything that was good about BSF. And he had a particular venomous attack on architects, blaming us for all the ills of BSF, when in reality, BSF, there were lots of problems with it, but it was mainly procurement to do with PFI and all sorts of other issues. Architects were kind of, I wouldn't say blameless, but for him to kind of completely turn the problems onto us was a real issue. But I suppose a deeper worry really was his claim that there's no relationship between building quality and architectural achievement. And he went about, reformulating or trying to reimagine the schools as serious places for learning, that it doesn't really matter where you might learn. To put that into context, I think that the costs for BSF, they spiraled out of control in the early years, but we were just about getting it right. And the standard cost for a BSF school was about 1,600 to 1,800 quid per square metre. What Michael Gove wanted to do was target 500 to 600 quid a square metre, which is a phenomenal cut. He had no substance to back this up, apart from the fact that he had some, I think some American schools at the time were doing something similar, but completely different context. The early days, it was kind of talking about, do we go back to a prefabricated model? Well, we've been doing that since the 60s, and architects were best placed, to really deliver these kind of schools. This is Hunstanton School by Smithson's, a modular kit of parts which could be readily adaptable to different sites. And we were doing it in housing. This is a volumetric housing project we've got back in 2000 in Dalston, Rains Court. So architects were best placed to kind of really help and assist the government with this kind of new drive for efficiency. But no, he went to the market, a different part of the market. So what do you do? What do you get for 500 quid a square metre? This is one of our schools, I think at the more expensive end of BSF, about £2,000, £2,100 a square metre. This is Westminster Academy. This had a sponsor which kind of boosted that budget. This is the T building in Shoreditch, an office building, which this is a light touch refurb. This is what you get for about £700 a square metre. So you've got an existing building and this is a fit out. So how the hell are you going to do a school for 500 quid a square metre? Well, this is his big idea at the time, is that he'll get the boys in from Tesco's and Dixon's, and actually it'll just be a shed, and that's about what you get with nothing in it for £500 a square metre. Interestingly, though, we were already doing this in terms of prefabrication. This is Lang O'Rourke up in Yorkshire. They had a factory ready to go, which is all about making kit-apart schools. And we had actually completed one of these schools in Dagenham, where absolutely everything was done off-site, so floors, walls, columns, and they're all loaded with services, so smart wall systems, and just craned into place. And a very modular school which could be adapted, readily adapted to different educational ways of teaching in different sites. But no, that was ignored. 18 months later, I think he finally figured that this wasn't really going to work. So what they did then, they kind of commissioned another set of architects, and they came up with this idea. They had the Educational Funding Agency produced 2 different plan types, the super block, and then there was a finger block as well, with a target of £1,200 a square metre. So interestingly, though, that's very similar to the plan for Dagenham Park School. So it took them 18 months to come up with that. And interestingly, then 36 months later, the target spiraled up again, so it was up to 1,400 quid a square metre, which is about what we had done Dagenham Park for 36 months earlier. So that's a rant over now. But that really does set the scene for where we were with Birmingham BSF, because it's definitely the backdrop. We were, I suppose, one of the last projects. Birmingham had a plan to rebuild 90 schools back in 2009. I think we were number 20 on the list, and then BSF got canned, so we were the last one through. So you can imagine the contractors, they're going to try and squeeze every penny out of this, because their profits were based on 90 schools, not 20. So they had a longer game plan on this. So I suppose that was tough times, really, because any sense of kind of joy or anything else which we were kind of might have had in the early days was going to be squeezed out. So the building had to be incredibly efficient. Everything had to pay for itself and justify itself in order for it to get through. So Waverley School, it's about 4 kilometres east of the centre of Birmingham, quite a deprived area. This was the original school, built for 400, and there was 900 in there. Added to that, we had to incorporate a primary school, so this idea of an all-through school, all contained in one building, so kids from the age of 4 to 17 would be in the same school. That posed its own particular design challenges. Just some key statistics there. Interestingly, 10% with English as a first language, 60% of kids on free school meals. So a challenging area, but an incredibly positive cohort, and the teaching staff as well. So there was a real sense that we could do something good here, even though the budget was incredibly tight. The site we were given, it's about 1 kilometre away from the existing school on an old allotment site. What was interesting, there's 2 kilometres of boundary, but only 90 metres of frontage, which had a lot of challenges, really, but also a lot of opportunities. Huge fall across the site, 10 metres. That, again, how you place a standard building on a site which is, kind of falling down 10 metres. Again, interesting to do that on a budget. Some photographs looking over the allotments here, very overgrown, lots of shrubbery and I think Japanese knotweed as well. There is an image of the frontage, not much to it really, but it's in the context of 1950s domestic housing in outer Birmingham, and what we were putting in this massive civic building and how that was going to stitch in. Was really important, actually, how we kind of knit that in without just looking like it's landed. This is the kind of the early briefing process, and this idea of educational progression was really, really important, particularly trying to incorporate the younger kids from 3, how they're going to feel safe in that environment, and how they're going to kind of progress through the school. And it was a cluster-based system as well, which is part of the brief, which is this idea of schools within a school. So we had 1,800 kids, so the idea of breaking them down into manageable either year or subject-based groups is really important. But interesting with schools, I mean, you look at the diagram on the bottom right-hand corner, most things want to be on the ground floor, and almost everything wants to be facing into the hall as well. It's almost impossible when you're trying to do that over 3 stories, so you start the kind of horse trading about what goes where, what blocks get, or what bits get paired up with each other. So you go about producing these kind of diagrams. With BSF, you have a very, very, very finite kind of amount of area to work with. It's all very prescriptive. It's all based on lots of formulas produced by the government. So you start off with kind of diagrams which are very dry like this to scale, looking at all the components of each of the cluster, and then looking at key adjacencies, what needs to go where. I mean, a key part of the brief really was the pairing of a generic cluster, generic maths, English, with specialist clusters such as design technology, science. So those kind of adjacencies were incredibly key to the brief, really, and they were going to form, I suppose, the DNA of the kind of the massing of the scheme. Interestingly, all of these are footprints of I suppose, most of our schools. And all of them are derived from a very similar set of criteria in terms of the area allowances, which come from, it's a document called BB98, which is now defunct, but quite an interesting document. But each of these buildings are incredibly site-specific and educationally specific as well, so driven through collaboration with the educational team and engaging with the site. Gove's idea was that one plan should fit all, it shouldn't be site-specific. And these diagrams, I think, just go some way to showing that actually the plan should really derive from those ongoing conversations over many months, even years, to try and get the right solution for that context. Kind of the early sketches you do in the early days, looking at different configurations, looking at how the clusters might sit on the site. I'm not going to go into these very much, really, but one we settled on, really, after a lot of looking at the clusters itself. So these are just early sketches trying to establish how those bits of kind of stuff go together to form one of these clusters. Interestingly, I will talk a little bit about this now, this idea of a school within a school. So you get your classrooms, and then all of these support rooms, teaching staff, breakout spaces, all contained within that individual cluster, which I suppose minimizes kids having to travel time within the school. That's a specialist cluster, science, which is much bigger. So we settled very early on this idea of a series of fingers, of bars, which the site is falling down that way, which kind of cascade down the hill and really deal with that topography, but they really then engage with this idea of a boulevard or a street as the main entrance. It's a very efficient model we'll talk a little bit about in a second. Again, I'm just putting this on here. I mean, atriums are great. They are wonderful. But in the world of BSF, every bit of that floor area has to be paid for. It's all quantified, and it all comes from this brief you get. And we found that in this context, not always, in this context, to be particularly wasteful. And I suppose one of our main ideas is we're going to take this space and pro-rata, we're going to give it to all of the teaching spaces. So we're going to have wide corridors, we're going to have social spaces within the clusters. So rather than this kind of glory atrium space within the entrance or arrival area, we take all that and we give it back to the teaching areas so they feel more generous and they feel more welcoming, and the kids want to stay in their clusters longer. So as an organizational diagram to the school, we have those series of bars, but really important was how we connect in a civic way with the entrance. And we have this idea, we flashed this up in the early days, I haven't seen this in years, but this idea of the stately home, this grand arrival, the boulevard, we have a 70-metre long walk to the front gate, but that was quite a nice idea, really, and something which we've tried to maintain. Some early sketches about that. So it's 20 metres wide by 70, which connects with the main entrance and the halls behind. And then the idea then at the entrance, you're trying to mark that entrance on the street. It's quite a domestic environment, so we didn't want a big building right on the street, not here anyway, but somehow you have a marker on the street which really does bring that entrance 70 metres up that boulevard to the street. Was quite key, really. So the bar to the west became the primary teaching area. And most important about this is that these kids get delivered to their own front door. And there's almost these concentric layers of protection for them that, the big noisy kids are here. Then they've got your primary hall. You've got the social areas for the kids here, classrooms, and then their own particular outside space. And it was really important that you had this kind of almost like an onion, these layers of protection so they felt safe. But what's really interesting is the kids from day one, they have uniforms here. So they do feel part of the bigger, the bigger school. But even still, we just wanted the school to feel like a primary school rather than just part of a bigger secondary school. And crucial to that really was a very fluid and open layout. So rather than doors and rather than doors, we've got a series of screens which subdivide these very fluid classrooms. So there's a real sense of, the inside-outside connection, but also fluidity between classrooms as well. And then this becomes the main teaching bar here. So in the north, we've got a generic cluster. Central to that there, this is a social learning zone as we coined it. So this is kind of that mini atrium. This is that atrium paying for this space here. Very deep planned space, 22.5 metres wide. Most schools tend to be about 15, 16. But this was all based on efficiency and really getting these spaces to work. The only reason that space did work is because it was always connected to an external terrace and a group room. So to say we laboured this plan for months and months and months and months is an understatement. This was such a plan-driven building. Those clusters are connected by this knuckle, so circulation in schools is really, really important. Circulation and toilets, so important in terms of surveillance and bullying. And this idea that you're really, really close to the central part of reception, it's really easy to monitor kids in this area. So we've got this idea of this central staircase, toilet. Just get rid of any opportunity for bullying, make it as easy for kids to go between lessons and break times as possible, and just have it open, lots of light as well. It's kind of basic things, but a lot of schools don't really get that right. And this is where the contractor loved us, because we proposed to put kind of the big dark space at the centre of the plan. And for us it was good as well, because we did get that glory space, that big volume rather than the atrium. But this is our halls, dining, lecture theatre, all in the centre of the plan, in the heart of the school. But what that does, though, that orange line there, is all about wall-to-floor ratios. This is where contractors will kind of love you as an architect if you talk about these things, because that's pounds per square metre. That's kind of all of those good things. It's efficient. It's what Gove was talking about. But for us, that allowed us then to get extra money to pump into different aspects of the building. So they kind of trusted us at this stage because we were kind of speaking their language. And then we have a sports block, and this is a very utilitarian block. It houses, we've got biomass boilers and plant rooms, and the sports hall here, and the sixth form, finally cascading down the hill, as it were. This is one of the final diagrams of the cluster, really, and it kind of gives a sense of this was about the narrowest corridor in the school, and that's 2.7 metres wide, which is quite wide, actually. So, again, this was that lack of an atrium space, paying for generous circulation. And then this social heart to every cluster as well, where kids can hang out connected to the external terrace and group rooms. But also, I think what was important about this was trying to conceive a plan which, might adapt and evolve in the next 30, 40 years as teaching changes as well. So there's flexibility. This is almost like a shell. You can almost imagine any function going on in here. It could be an office building, or it could be a completely open kind of area when schools are taught in a very different way. But I think that's a long way down the line, but interesting ideas there as well. Some early sketches about how they might open up down there. I'm not going to talk much about the plan, but these are kind of the final plans here. Incredibly, a lot of work went into these. That was the main DNA of the block, where you got your normal cluster, your generic cluster, and then science here, large central social learning zone in the middle of the plan. So the idea that all these classrooms facing onto these social spaces is really important. Site plan, landscaping, incredibly important, needless to say. Just some photos looking at that social learning zone. There's no kids in the photographs. Really sorry about that. Schools are all about kids, but our photographer didn't have a CRB check on the day, so kids had to be ushered out, which is, it's a bit weird. I was going to Photoshop some in, but that would have been weirder. Classrooms. Anyone who's kind of looked into schools, you can see it's been tarred a little bit with the PFI brush, the suspended ceilings. Probably not what we would normally do in a school, but actually with PFI, there's a particular emphasis on longevity and maintenance, which you've got to play by the rules a little bit sometimes. Classrooms, and then some more of the components of that generic cluster: group rooms, social heart, terraces. And that is our 2.6 wide corridor, which opens out to a double height space. An image of the heart of the school, really. So we've got some of our black box functions here. We've got entrance, library at the heart of the school as well, auditorium, and then dining space here. I suppose what was quite efficient about this is you're only really paying for 2 walls and a roof, because this is where that efficiency comes in of wall-to-floor ratio. which means you can spend your money elsewhere. And then coming up with some really pragmatic solutions for things like acoustics. This is a Siberian larch wall, which is just simple softwood battens on a felt backing, which open out. And that felt really soaks up the acoustics, far cheaper than a lot of the gaudy baffles you might see and all of the other kind of off-the-shelf acoustic solutions. So a really, really cheap and textural way to kind of achieve a really important kind of function. Some images from one of the walkways looking down at the dining space. This idea of these Wagamama benches, which I see you've got outside as well, very social and just makes it feel like a fun, grown-up place to be. Yeah, just some images, the same space. Auditorium connected to that space directly, and they open out onto each other. So black box function could be in the deepest, darkest parts of the plan. And then just some bits of furniture, which this is that idea of that buffer for the younger kids. They've got this kind of this learning, social area full of all these fun stuff, which is there now, not in this photograph. In terms of the external appearance, this is another, going back to the idea of efficiency and kind of, you know, the contractor is your boss here or is your client rather than the school. And by far the most efficient way to kind of to look at how a classroom might kind of function, we looked at a lot of different ways in terms of configurations of windows and openings. But we found in our particular context, 3 windows works really well. Classrooms tend to be 7.5 by 7.5 meters wide. 3 windows, naturally ventilated, repeating through the whole block, incredibly efficient. But that's your starting point, really. Another starting point for us, I know this is the Ibstock series. I thought I'd give a nod to brick dimensions here. But from day one, we looked at brick dimensions. We didn't want any cut bricks on this project. So the grid was 7650 by 3.6, piers were 1125 from the beginning. So you make it much easier on yourself if you can have these considerations early on. We wanted it to be built of brick. A lot of the bad BSF projects had these kind of gaudy, multicolored facades, which are actually incredibly expensive. Brick is by far the most cost-effective solution, and you know, it's got longevity and beauty and richness to it as well. So yeah, I mean, that's pretty dull, to be honest. But with that, you get your special moments. How do you incorporate your staircase? How does that kind of break down as you get double aspect rooms, bigger rooms as well? So you might have 3 windows for your standard classroom, but a standard classroom is probably 50% of the overall makeup of the school. So you can have a bit of fun then at end elevations and how it might mutate towards particular local internal conditions. So this is an image of one of those corner conditions as well, where you're ventilating through this way, so you've got bigger fixed windows, which really do help to animate that facade. Another trick we used really, and this was a first for us, is using kind of, well, it's not first using blinds, but the idea that we have this kind of monochromatic building, which becomes a backdrop for colour. So we've used blinds, lots of different colour blinds, as a kind of a secondary layering, which is actually quite effective. But yeah. In terms of the brick, we didn't have far to look really. All around Birmingham you get these wonderful railway arches and Victorian warehouses built with these Staffordshire blue bricks, which are essentially red bricks starved of oxygen. So we found a brick which was very, very cost effective. I mean, this was the recession, so there was, I suppose, they were vying for a lot of business. So this came from 20 meters, or 20 meters, that'd be good, 20 miles from the site. And it's about £300 per thousand. That's quite cheap, by the way. And then we were looking at a secondary accent brick, a white brick, which are normally quite expensive. But again, in Wales, we found this, which is a concrete brick. And that was even cheaper. And then that was going to be used where we needed to bounce light deeper into the plan, mark entrances, and the like. We chose 2 different bricks for the primary brick. So we've got a smooth one, which is going to reflect the light, and then a drag-faced one, which essentially is a very rough, which absorbs the light. And we arranged it in a hit-and-miss pattern, which really does help break down the scale of of the overall volume of the wall. Also has an incredibly rich texture. I suppose one of the advantages of having a very efficient building as well is that we could persuade the contractor to have a deep reveal, which isn't always a given. If you look around town, you'll see windows flush with the external wall, which is a bit miserable. There's no depth or layering to the project, where actually it's more expensive, but it's really, really important if you can get a bit of depth to that window reveal. It really does help that facade in a huge way. Little things as well. This is the primary. Having low window sills, it should be a given, but unfortunately it's not. Kids are small. They should be able to see out over the windowsill. But again, that was a big battle, even to do simple things like that with a contractor. And then just some photographs. This is looking at the primary. You can see here, using that white concrete brick to mark the entrances here and just make that more legible. And then in the terraces as well, we have the hit-miss pattern, but that white brick bouncing light deeper into the plan. It is a deep plan building. Just an image of those terraces. And then looking back, I suppose one of the problems I talked earlier about this idea of dealing with topography and how the buildings have to deal with this massive level change. We did it in two ways, really. One is between sport and the main teaching block, you've got a massive retaining wall and a big staircase. That was just a function of kind of what we needed there, but it's not necessarily the best way of doing it in terms of landscaping or kind of even architecturally. But for the main, between the primary and main block, so this is that dining area here. We had this idea of this kind of cascading series of allotments, which really deal quite well with that level change. It also becomes a really social space for kids at lunchtime. But there's a really nice idea of former allotments, allotment beds here, to dining area here, to kitchens. And the first thing they did, because this was the school's own space to kind of inhabit as they want, really. That was quite exciting. So they've planted olive bushes and other plants and other kind of food growing plants. And what's really cool is they've dealt with a level change in their own particular way as well. They put a slide in, which that is really cool. Our landscape architects weren't nearly as fun as that, but it's really nice. I went back a few months ago and kind of just to see this happening is really, really nice. And then that's just an image walking back of the composition of the buildings. That was really important to us as well, about these monolithic blocks, how they fit in the landscape and how they kind of, the varying heights and arrangement and the arrangement. View down, so the allotments on the right-hand side there. So really important, the primary block, the primary school block has got a different scale to it than the main block, which is, I suppose, much more full-on, much more serious. You go from 2-story to 4-story. And then a view of the main entrance, that boulevard connecting to the front reception area. A really important part of the school, really, for us was about this idea of graphics and wayfinding. So there was a wayfinding budget. I can't remember what it was, but I mean, our take on wayfinding is that, well, if you design it really well, you shouldn't really need very much wayfinding. That, things should be intuitive. And so for us, we used our wayfinding budget, kind of this idea of giving the school an identity. We do it on all our schools. We've got a collaborator called Morag Myerscough, who's an illustrator based in Hoxton, and she really helps us on a lot of our projects, working with the pupils, looking at how we kind of inhabit this white, sterile space. These clusters, I suppose, were designed as a backdrop to the identity which would evolve, in collaboration with the kids. So the main circulation space became this, we call it the history wall. And it really is a kind of a learning experience, looking at all the different nationalities of the kids, all contribute to this, and looking at the connections between different cultures and over time, and how that inhabits then a 3-story staircase was really, really interesting and cool piece of work, actually. You could spend all day just reading and looking at this, but you get a sense now that this quite simple space becomes very, very animated and dramatic. And then simple things like lockers and how to kind of give each of those clusters their own identity. and just give it a bit of a life, really, and a bit of personality. This was one of the more interesting exercises, really, working with some of the older primary kids and actually creating these patterns based on, kind of, again, different cultural influences and looking at kind of how they respond and kind of work with these patterns and kind of what they produce as well. And then that got turned into kind of much larger graphics within the circulation spaces and in the primary areas and the admin space as well. So really, really cool ways of animating and giving personality, which is meaningful to that part of the school. So this is an admin corridor, which is quite lively and a lot of fun. And the kids really felt a connection to their environment through this process. And then just simple things like this is wayfinding, this is lifts and staircases. Again, these were, I think this was either MDF or kind of a plastic cutout, which is layered. And then through this process, we gave the school a new identity and a new logo. This kind of big super graphic, which sits in the reception area, has become the school crest. And then that can be adapted for many, many different things, from letterheads to the blazers and lots of different kind of functions. That's it. I think I was going to have more photographs of the building, but
thanks, Cormac. That was a really interesting run through the design process. Hopefully that's a bit of inspiration for anyone working on larger projects this year. Has anyone got any questions for Cormac at all?
Sorry, I couldn't hear.
Sorry.
Yeah.
With the formulas.
Yeah.
If the formulas had been working before, we wouldn't really need to rebuild the schools. Why would they take that into account and not challenge in the way that designing a new school and a new environment?
Well, the formulas were based. Are you familiar with BB98 and kind of? That was very prescriptive, and you had to work with them. I'm not sure if you're talking about what's changed since then now, but...
As in with designing this school, for example,
yeah.
the sizes of the classrooms, the way the clusters were had to be the specific way, the science areas. Was there any actually move on that, or did you have to stick with...
Oh, no, there's a lot of flexibility within that. I mean, there's lots of room for interpretation. And to be honest, a good architect can use that to your own advantage, because all of the clusters, for instance, were different sizes. They didn't stack up neatly. You can look at that there, and the building stacks up very, very neatly on itself. So there's a lot of horse trading about squashing things, displacing things. They're a great starting point, but yeah, I think there's room for manoeuvre there. What Michael Gove has done, though, is he's kind of taken those formulas and chopped 15% off, made classrooms smaller, gotten rid of all of the social spaces and all of the good things that BSF had done. So, yeah.
Just what does BSF stand for?
Building schools for the future, or for the past. Well, I mean, one of the things about the cluster-led model is that they are schools within schools. The primary kids stay in their own location and they're given layers of protection. But It is an interesting question because we have done all through schools before, and they tend to be, it's a different school on the campus, and that's their own environment. Here, the direct brief was, no, they're of the same part of the school. They need to feel included. So it's kind of rethink that idea of progression through the school so that they're not, it's really good because they don't feel intimidated when they make the transition from primary to secondary school. And it's a really interesting idea, but it has to be such a fundamental part of the educational vision, and you need the staff and the backup to make that happen and work. And the staff had to be educated, actually. That was a crucial part of it. Yeah, that was an interesting question. We had to derogate against, so BB98 had very particular criteria on acoustics. We put in lots of acoustic baffling within the spaces. It does get noisy because, I mean, open plan teaching is not a thing of, it's not a new invention by any means. But interestingly, we actually designed it that it could be retrofitted with doors, so those screens could easily accommodate doors. It wasn't as fluid and open as you might think, so there was quite a lot of acoustic treatment. But yeah, little kids do make lots of noise. Yeah.
What's the lifespan that you designed the buildings to last for?
Well, again, what's really interesting about PFI is that the contractors are thinking about 30 years because that's when the maintenance agreement runs out, which is a bit depressing. Whereas we're thinking 100, 120 years for this building. This has got longevity. The whole idea about this is a building which will be here for a long time. And that's why we wanted to move away from the cheap plastic buildings which were associated with the early days of BSF, which are built for 30 years essentially. Because as soon as you stop looking after them, they tend to deteriorate quite quickly. Yeah. But lots of secondary is very permeable, and the primary kids get their own front door to their own classrooms. That was really important. Yeah.
I was just wondering, all the infographics and all the colour that you've placed in sort of, and all the details that you've placed in the design, do you feel like the students now kind of respect the property, less likely to deface it?
Yeah, well, this was a real, this white wall here in the sports hall, white brick wall, it's not about graphics here, but we were really worried about graffiti. There's been very little graffiti, and internal there's been virtually none. Snippets of it, but that's kind of, they really do feel part of that environment. What's really interesting about this school, and I'm not saying we played a major part in this, I think this, but it does go to show you that the kind of strength of the educational vision behind it, but this school is now Ofsted outstanding. And in this location, in this particular context, that's quite an achievement for the head. Hopefully the educational environment had something to do with that, but the teaching staff were phenomenal, and they are phenomenal.
How did the design actually take into account the environment? So being that it's being put into a residential area where before it was very quiet, development, and now there's 2,000 kids playing around and making a lot of noise. How does the neighbourhood actually react to it?
With dread and fury. A lot of people didn't think we'd be able to get a school on this site given the limited frontage, but for us, we kind of play this game of sliding these blocks back and marking the entrance with a kind of much more domestic feel to it, and trying to keep back from the neighbours as well. You can see that the blocks kind of taper down as they blend into the two-storey. So the primary block is the most adjacent to the residential neighbourhood. So the idea that they taper into that as well and they're set back. But you're right, 2,000 kids coming in at 8:30 in the morning to a quiet street that's why we really made a big play on that boulevard, that stately home idea. But that there's enough room for them to scream and charge around, but not out in the street.
At what point in the design did you, or in the design process, did you engage the students and the teachers?
Quite early on, actually, and it was continuous. but quite early on.
Is there any plan for people to come on the site? Or was that?
Well, interestingly, this block here came on stream halfway through the project. This is a sixth form, so this wasn't funded originally. But this idea, this diagram could repeat and kind of work its way down the hill without compromising. And in a way, this sports block here was almost like the showpiece, this sculptural object. And we had this idea of this view from the sports pitch of this sculptural thing. And then the sixth form came into it, which originally had been on the other end of the site, but this worked out to be the best. So I think the sports hall would have been actually a different thing if this had been part of the brief. Maybe the sports block would have been here.
Yeah, I mean, in the cluster system as well, do you account for like future developments that you can go into that system?
Yeah.
Okay, any more questions? Okay, well, thank you again, Cormac, for coming and talking to us about that.
Okay.
Thank you all for coming. Next week, the second lecture in the series is by Ecomotive, who are looking at developing microhomes in Bristol and pocket housing, snug homes. So that will be a really interesting talk at the opposite end of the spectrum to what we've seen here. So it'd be great to see you all there. Thank you, Cormac. Oh, great.
Is that right?
Yeah, really good. Thank you.
I've never presented.